The morning sun had just begun its slow crawl over the jagged horizon, painting the small settlement with streaks of gold and dusty brown. The air smelled of river water and fresh pine, a scent that carried the promise of warmth, but also the unease that comes with early hours. A young bride, trembling and soaked, stumbled out of the river's edge, her white dress clinging to her like a second skin. The current had been merciless, pulling her under for a moment that stretched like an eternity. Her breath came in sharp gasps, heart hammering, as she realized she was alive, but utterly exposed to the eyes of strangers and the judgment of a world that expected her to be perfect, graceful, untouchable. The man who had saved her stood silently nearby, tall and unyielding, with the quiet strength of someone born in the unforgiving lands beyond the settlement. His skin bore the sun's dark kiss, and his eyes reflected a history both fierce and mournful. There was no hesitation in the way he reached for her hand, guiding her carefully onto the riverbank, water dripping from her hair and dress. Though his presence was commanding, it carried a gentleness that seemed impossible, a contradiction she could not reconcile. She wanted to speak, to thank him, but her voice refused to cooperate, caught somewhere between fear and awe. Behind the wooden fences of the small homestead, the sound of boots crunching against packed earth stirred a new tension in the air. Her husband waited, hands tight on the reins of his horse, his jaw set in a line that spoke more of anger than relief. He had seen the water churn, seen the shapes of struggle from across the clearing, and now he waited, a figure of silent judgment, anticipation curling around him like smoke from a distant fire. The space between the man who had saved her and the husband who now waited was taut with unspoken questions, a line drawn in the morning light that neither of them had yet crossed. The river behind them whispered secrets, carrying away the traces of panic and leaving only wet footprints on the muddy bank. She looked at the Apache man, noticing how his hands were steady, how his eyes seemed to weigh her without malice or desire, simply taking measure of her presence as though the river itself had marked her for something larger than herself. Her mind spun with the absurdity of it all. She had been preparing for a simple wedding, the kind that promised safety, family, and routine. Instead, she had been flung into the arms of the wilderness and brought back by a man she barely knew, drenched and shaken to her core. The husband's boots stopped just short of the threshold, the horse shifting beneath him, muscles taut. The sound of hooves and his slow, measured steps had become another kind of current in the morning, one that pressed against her chest and reminded her of the world waiting beyond the river's edge. She could feel his gaze, heavy and assessing, trying to read her from across the short distance. A part of her wanted to run, to vanish into the forest and let the Apache man carry her farther from judgment and expectation. But another part, the part that had promised loyalty and duty, kept her rooted, making her shiver not only from cold but from the weight of the life she had chosen. The Apache man, sensing the tension, did not move. His presence alone seemed to command the river, the wind, the very space between them, as if he were a guardian not just of her body, but of some fragile truth she had yet to understand. He bent slightly to offer her his arm, a simple gesture, but one that spoke of unspoken codes and ancient ways. She took it hesitantly, feeling the heat from his body, the steady strength that had pulled her from the water. There was no ceremony, no pretense, only survival and the unarticulated acknowledgement that life had a strange way of crossing paths, throwing people together in the most inconvenient, necessary ways. The husband cleared his throat, a low, deliberate sound that cut through the quiet like a blade. The bride felt the tremor in her chest, the sharp spike of fear that comes from realizing that safety is not the same as forgiveness. She could hear the river gurgle behind her, see the morning sun glinting off its surface, and know that time was folding around them in this small, charged moment. Every eye, every step, every drop of water carried significance beyond simple comprehension. I can take her the rest of the way, the Apache man said finally, his voice calm but firm, a voice that carried authority without demanding it. He glanced toward the house, then back at her husband, as if measuring how much could be said without words. The bride felt a flicker of relief, mixed with guilt, and wondered if her trembling was from cold, fear, or some unnameable recognition of what had just occurred. Her husband's hands tightened on the reins. He did not speak, did not move, only studied the man who had intervened with quiet scrutiny. The air between them became almost tangible, thick with the weight of pride, ownership, gratitude, and suspicion all at once. The young bride could feel herself caught between worlds, the one she had known before, simple and bounded by social codes, and this new, wild one that the Apache man represented, vast and untethered, offering both danger and protection. Every sound seemed louder in that moment, the slap of water against rocks, the rustle of leaves in the gentle morning breeze, the distant calls of birds. She noticed them, yet she could not take her eyes off the two men who now framed her in a triangle of tension, power, and unresolved questions. The river had done more than nearly take her life. It had shifted the balance of what was expected, what was owed, and what could be imagined. The Apache man moved closer, keeping his posture respectful but unyielding, a careful negotiation in every step. His eyes flicked to her husband again, and though there was no smile, no sign of submission, there was a kind of understanding, as if he knew the rules, but also the exceptions. She felt a strange stir of curiosity, fear, and admiration, a mix she could not name and dared not voice. The river had pulled her into more than water. It had pulled her into the unknown currents of human emotion, loyalty, and conflict. Her husband finally spoke, his voice low and steady, carrying the weight of ownership but tinged with the sharp edge of uncertainty. "I'll take it from here," he said, though there was no movement in his figure to suggest he intended to act immediately. He measured the Apache man with a long, silent stare, a challenge that went unspoken but fully understood. The bride's teeth chattered. Whether from cold or anxiety she could not tell. She knew the story of the day would ripple through the town, whispered in corners, discussed behind shutters and doors, speculating on who had saved whom and why. But in this moment, only 3 people mattered. The river had claimed its mark, the man had done his deed, and the husband's presence weighed like iron across her shoulders. Without warning, the Apache man shifted, a subtle but deliberate movement that put him closer to her yet still outside the line of confrontation. His hand brushed hers, not in intimacy, but in reassurance, a gesture of steadying strength. She felt it, and for the first time since falling into the river, a small spark of calm returned. She did not yet understand what it meant, or what it would cost her, but she knew the day had changed forever. The husband's gaze followed every motion, unblinking, calculating. There was a tension in his jaw, a quiet threat that needed no words to be understood. The river behind them continued its steady whisper, carrying the echoes of struggle and survival, as if reminding them all that the world moved on whether they were ready or not. The young bride's eyes flicked between the 2 men, heart pounding, knowing that what happened next would set the course of her life in ways she could not yet comprehend. She shivered again, not entirely from cold, but from the electric uncertainty of human will, pride, and unspoken allegiance all colliding in one sharp, unyielding morning. The Apache man inclined his head slightly, a silent acknowledgment that he had delivered her safely and would not overstep the bounds drawn by the husband's presence. Yet in that gesture there was a question, an invitation, an unvoiced promise that lingered in the air, heavier than the mist rising from the river. The bride felt it, raw and undeniable, and it unsettled her more than the fall, the river, or the chill of the morning combined. As the first light fully illuminated the clearing, revealing the rough outlines of the homestead, the riverbank, and the 2 men who now defined her world, the bride realized she was at the edge of something larger than herself. Survival had brought her here, but choice, loyalty, and the shifting currents of human intent would carry her forward. And yet, the question remained. Who would claim her story, and who would leave her to the river of uncertainty that now ran through her life? The morning held its breath. The river murmured its secrets. The Apache man stood, silent but watchful. The husband's gaze never wavered. And the bride, trembling, wet, and aware of every heartbeat, knew the moment of reckoning had not yet arrived. She was caught between salvation and judgment, protection and possession, fear and curiosity. The currents of human will and nature itself swirled around her, unstoppable, unrelenting, and poised to change the course of her life forever. The sun climbed higher and shadows shortened, but the tension remained unbroken. A choice hung in the air, suspended, as fragile and sharp as the morning light reflecting off the river's restless surface. She could feel it in her bones, in her heart, in every drop of water still clinging to her skin. The story had only begun. The river had claimed her for a moment, but now life and the decisions of two men would decide what the next moments would bring. The young bride drew a shaky breath, looking from the Apache man to her husband, and back again, knowing that one word, one gesture, one shift in stance could tip the morning into chaos or calm. The river behind her whispered its warning, the house loomed with silent expectations, and the horizon stretched wide with possibilities she could not yet grasp. She stood there, wet, vulnerable, and alive, on the edge of an unknown path, waiting for the first move. And in that pregnant silence, the story waited with her, ready to unfold in ways no one could yet imagine. The air was heavy with questions and unspoken truths. The morning had begun, but the resolution had not arrived. Choices lingered like fog over the river, and only the next heartbeat would reveal which currents would carry them all forward. The young bride's gaze lingered on the river, and then she looked up at the two men who had become the center of her world in a single chaotic morning. She shivered again, uncertain whether it was cold or the weight of what was to come. And in that silence, the river, the house, and the people around her seemed to hold their breath, waiting for the next step, the next word, the next move. The story had only just begun. The Apache man remained still, a quiet sentinel of the river's mercy. The husband shifted his weight, restless, the reins in his hands tightening. And the bride, wet and trembling, knew that everything had changed in the space of a single morning, and that nothing would ever be the same again. The river rippled behind them, unheeding, carrying its secrets onward. And in the tension of that moment, the air seemed to hum with possibility, danger, and an unspoken question. Who would guide the bride home, and who would claim her heart? The morning stretched on, and still no answer came. The morning hung heavy with a quiet tension, the kind that makes every small movement feel monumental. The young bride wrapped her arms around herself, trying to shake the chill from her soaked dress. But it wasn't only the cold that made her shiver. She could feel the weight of the eyes upon her, the steady, measured gaze of the Apache man, and the sharp, possessive watchfulness of her husband. Neither had moved, yet the air was taut with unspoken questions, judgments, and the potential for conflict. It was a strange, fragile balance, and she wondered if it could hold long enough for her to breathe. She remembered the river. How quickly it had pulled her under, how dark and cold it had seemed as the current tossed her about. She had screamed once, a sound that seemed to vanish instantly into the roar of the water. Then hands strong, sure had gripped her, and she had been lifted into the world again, leaving only the river's murmur as proof of what she had endured. That memory clung to her now, sharp and real, making her heart beat faster, making the world outside the water feel unreal in comparison. The Apache man's presence was calm, almost unnerving in its steadiness. He was the kind of figure that drew attention without demanding it, whose silence could hold as much power as a shout. She realized she knew nothing about him beyond what her eyes told her. The dark skin, the precise movements, The quiet strength that had saved her? Who was he really? What had brought him to this river at this precise moment to intervene in her life? Questions pressed against her, but she had no answers, only the echo of the river and the awareness of her husband's watchful eyes. Her husband remained at the edge of the clearing, his horse shifting restlessly beneath him. He was not a cruel man, she thought, at least not in ways she could easily name. He had been steady, dependable, and had offered her security. Yet something in the way he held himself now made her wonder if trust could ever be restored after this morning. His hands tightened on the reins, the muscles in his jaw flexing as if preparing for a confrontation that had yet to come. The tension between the two men seemed to press down on her chest, a weight heavier than the river's drag. Memories of her life before the river surfaced unbidden. She had grown up in a town where appearances mattered more than truth, where whispers could ruin a reputation faster than any act of defiance. Marriage had promised her stability, a chance to belong, and a sense of purpose in a world that often felt unyielding. But now, after the river and the intervention, she felt the fragile walls of that life begin to crack. The Apache man represented something untamed, unpredictable, a reminder that the world beyond her fences and familiar streets held forces she could neither control nor fully understand. The air shifted slightly, carrying a faint scent of smoke from a distant fire, or perhaps the warmth of the earth itself under the morning sun. The young bride noticed it and realized how attuned she had become to every detail, the way the wind moved, the way the river rippled, the subtle sounds of boots and hooves on packed dirt. Each detail carried significance, each movement held meaning. Life, she understood suddenly, was a series of currents, each one pulling at her in directions she could not yet name. The Apache man spoke again, his voice low, deliberate, carrying an authority that required no assertion. "You should get inside. You are cold, wet, and vulnerable. The house will offer warmth." His words were simple, but the tone held a weight she could feel in her bones. She wanted to speak, to insist she could manage, but the memory of the river and the strength of his hands reminded her that she had no energy for argument. Her husband's gaze did not shift. He said nothing, but the set of his shoulders, the line of his mouth, spoke volumes. The young bride felt herself caught in the middle, unable to move without acknowledging the presence of both men and the invisible tension they carried between them. She took a tentative step forward, the wet fabric of her dress dragging against her legs, and felt the eyes of the Apache man follow her with a precision that was almost unsettling. As she approached the small wooden house, she noticed its worn boards, the familiar smell of smoke and cooked food that always greeted her when she crossed its threshold. Yet the comfort she expected was tempered by the morning's events. The house had always been a place of safety, a boundary against the wildness of the outside world. But today it seemed fragile, vulnerable to the intrusion of forces she could not control. The Apache man stayed close, moving with her but never crowding, his presence a steadying influence that she both appreciated and feared. She noticed the careful way he placed her hand on the doorframe, guiding her, supporting her without dominating. The gesture, simple as it seemed, carried with it a complexity she could not yet name: protection, understanding, perhaps even recognition of something deeper. Her husband finally moved, a slow step forward, the horse shifting beneath him. His eyes never left the Apache man, studying, measuring, as if calculating the exact line between confrontation and tolerance. The young bride felt a pang of unease, a recognition that the morning's events had altered the balance of her life in ways that were not yet visible. The river had delivered her into someone else's hands, and now the world outside seemed to wait for the consequences of that delivery. Inside the house, the fire sputtered in the hearth, offering a soft warmth that contrasted sharply with the chill of the river and the crisp morning air outside. The young bride moved toward it, her hands shaking slightly as she rubbed at her arms, trying to coax life back into fingers stiff from cold. The familiar surroundings offered some comfort, but the memory of the river and the man who had saved her lingered, refusing to be dismissed. She glanced toward the doorway, aware that her husband's figure was silhouetted against the brightening morning. He had followed her inside only partially, lingering at the threshold, a silent sentinel. She knew he was measuring, calculating, waiting for some signal she could not yet provide. The tension between them was like a living thing, coiling, stretching, waiting for a spark that could ignite or extinguish it. The Apache man remained at her side, a quiet presence that seemed almost unnatural in its steadiness. He did not offer explanations, did not speak of the river, the fall, or the forces that had brought them together. He simply waited, patient and still, allowing her to regain some semblance of composure while remaining fully aware of the husband's gaze and the unspoken challenge it carried. She thought again of the river, its relentless pull, the way it had seemed to claim her only to return her to life. There was a rhythm to it, a force that had intervened in her world, shifting the boundaries she had known and testing the limits of what she could endure. The memory of cold water and near drowning clung to her, a reminder of how small one could feel against the forces of nature and circumstance. The husband finally spoke, a single, deliberate sentence that cut through the quiet. "You should explain yourself." The words were aimed as much at the Apache man as at her, and the tension in the room coiled tighter with the weight of expectation. She realized that explanation would be difficult, that words could not capture the full scope of fear, gratitude, and confusion that the morning had imposed upon her. The Apache man inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the husband without yielding. "I saved her." "Nothing more," he said calmly. The simplicity of his words belied the intensity in his eyes, the strength in his posture, and the quiet insistence that his actions had been deliberate, measured, and final in their intent. The young bride felt a surge of conflicting emotions, relief that she had survived, fear of what might follow, and an unnameable curiosity about the man who had intervened. She noticed the way his gaze lingered on her, not with desire or possession, but with recognition of her as a person who had faced something profound and survived. The weight of that recognition pressed on her chest in a way that was both comforting and disquieting. Outside, the river continued its slow, relentless journey, carrying with it memories of the fall, echoes of struggle, and the promise of forces beyond human understanding. She could hear it even inside the house, a quiet murmur that seemed to underscore the tension in the room and the unspoken questions between the three of them. Her husband's hand brushed against the doorframe as he moved toward the hearth, a subtle gesture of containment, perhaps, or control. She sensed that his watchfulness had not lessened, that the events of the morning had altered their dynamic irrevocably. There was no malice in his actions, only a fierce adherence to his own sense of order and propriety, a need to define boundaries that had been disrupted. The Apache man remained close, his presence a reminder of the river, of the moment of near drowning, and of the strange intersection of lives that had occurred in its current. The young bride felt herself caught between forces she could not name, pulled by the memory of the river, the protective strength of the man at her side, and the watchful gaze of the husband who claimed her life in ways both familiar and uncertain. Time seemed to stretch, elongated by the weight of uncertainty and the pressing quiet. Every sound, fire crackling, boots shifting, fabric brushing against the floor, became amplified, each a marker of the tension that filled the small room. She realized that the morning's events were only the beginning, that the river had introduced more than danger into her life. It had introduced choice, awareness, and the possibility of change. The Apache man's eyes flicked toward the window, toward the river that had claimed her moments ago. There was a look there she could not interpret, calculation, reflection, perhaps a memory of battles fought far from this quiet settlement. She felt an instinctive respect for the depth of experience implied in his gaze, a sense that she had only glimpsed the surface of a life shaped by forces she could not imagine. Her husband's voice, low and steady, cut through her thoughts again. "You will tell me everything that happened," he said, and she felt the weight of expectation in those words. Yet even as she nodded, she knew that some things could not be explained, that the river and the Apache man carried mysteries that words could not capture. The tension remained unresolved, suspended between them like a thin line stretched taut across the morning light. The young bride shivered once more, pulling her damp dress closer to her body. She was alive, yes, and safe for the moment, but the morning had shifted the boundaries of her life irreversibly. She was caught between survival and obligation, between the man who had saved her and the one who claimed her, and the river whispered that life would not return to the simplicity she had once known. Outside, the wind stirred, and the trees whispered in a language she could not decipher, a reminder that the world beyond her home was vast, untamed, and full of forces that demanded respect. The Apache man's gaze followed the movement, steady and unwavering, as if he were reading some unspoken sign in the sway of branches or the shimmer of light on water. She sensed his awareness, his connection to the wider world, and felt both comforted and unsettled by it. The husband shifted again, the reins tightening in his hands. His posture, firm and controlled, suggested that he was prepared for anything, yet even he could not predict the outcomes of the morning's events. The young bride realized that whatever resolution she hoped for would not come easily, that the currents of human will, pride, and circumstance would carry her forward whether she was ready or not. The river murmured in the distance, the fire crackled, and the room seemed to hold its breath. The young bride stood between the two men, wet, trembling, and aware that life had changed in ways she could not yet comprehend. Questions pressed in from every side. Who had truly saved her? What did the future hold for the three of them? And most importantly, what price would she pay for survival, protection, and the choices she had yet to make? The morning lingered, stretching long and tense. Outside, the river carried its secrets onward. Inside, the three of them stood in a quiet, charged triangle, each aware of the stakes, each aware of the other's presence and intent. The young bride drew a shaky breath, knowing that the story of this day and the forces it had set in motion was far from over. The currents of life and human will swirled around her, unstoppable, and the morning held the promise of revelations yet to come. The Apache man's eyes met hers for a brief moment, a flicker of understanding passing between them. Her heart beat faster, and she realized that she was caught not only between two men but between past and future, fear and courage, the known and the unknown. The river had claimed her once, and now it seemed poised to claim more, though in ways she could not yet see. The husband's voice broke the silence again, low and deliberate. "The day will demand answers. You must be ready." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. She nodded, uncertain if she could live up to them, uncertain if she even understood their full weight. The fire crackled, the river murmured, and the morning stretched on, full of possibilities, dangers, and unspoken truths. The young bride stood, wet and trembling, caught in a web of circumstance she could not yet untangle. The story was far from over, and the currents of fate had only begun to pull her forward, toward choices and revelations that would test her in ways she could not yet imagine. The tension remained unbroken, the room filled with the quiet weight of what had happened and what was yet to come. The young bride's gaze moved from the Apache man to her husband and back again, aware of the fragile balance, aware of the possibilities, aware that the river had changed everything. And in that moment, she understood that the morning had delivered more than cold water and danger. It had delivered a turning point, and nothing would ever be the same. The river flowed on, relentless and uncaring. The fire flickered, throwing shadows that danced across the wooden walls. And the young bride, still wet and shivering, felt the weight of the unknown pressing down, knowing that the next steps would define everything. The story was only beginning, and the currents of human will, pride and survival were already moving unstoppable toward an uncertain horizon. The sun climbed higher, and yet the small house seemed swallowed by an invisible tension that no light could disperse. Inside, the young bride moved quietly, wrapping a rough blanket around her shoulders, aware of the stillness that pressed against every wall. The fire in the hearth offered warmth, but it did little to ease the chill in her chest. The morning had changed everything, and the river had carried away more than her body. It had washed away the certainty she once held about her life, leaving only questions that seemed to grow heavier with each passing minute. Her husband lingered near the doorway, silent but watchful, his eyes fixed on the Apache man who had saved her. There was a subtle war waging in that glance, one she could feel even without words. The need to assert control, to reclaim authority over a life that now seemed partially claimed by someone else. She saw it in the set of his shoulders, the tight grip on the reins of his horse still tied just outside. The morning had shifted the power in their world, and the tension between the men now defined her very space. The Apache man remained calm, almost unnaturally so. Every movement he made was deliberate, controlled, measured. He did not rush to leave, nor did he step forward to assert himself. There was a patience in him that unsettled the bride, a quiet assurance that whatever path his day took, he was prepared for the weight it would carry. She realized that he understood the currents she had yet to name, the interplay of human pride, fear, and the unspoken codes that guided her husband's actions. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it scents of smoke, wet earth, and the river beyond. It was a reminder that life beyond these walls continued, indifferent to the struggles unfolding inside. The young bride glanced toward the window, her eyes tracing the river's curves as it wound through the valley. She remembered the grip of the current, the icy bite of the water, and the sudden strength of the man who had pulled her to safety. That memory now seemed like a shadow of the truth she lived in, a moment that had changed her in ways she could not yet understand. Her husband cleared his throat, low and deliberate. "I want the story in full. Start with why you were there." His voice was steady, but the sharp edge beneath it betrayed the storm behind his calm exterior. The young bride took a deep breath, realizing that every word she spoke now would be scrutinized, weighed, and measured. One misstep could shift the fragile balance in the room, and she felt the weight of the river, the Apache man, and her own trembling heart pressing against her chest. "I went to the river to gather water," she said finally, voice small but clear. "I didn't mean to." Her words faltered, and she shook her head, unable to explain the chaos that had followed. The Apache man's presence at her side reminded her that she was no longer entirely alone in the world. Yet she could feel the invisible chain of her husband's expectations tightening around her. The husband's eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in calculation. He could see the truth in her words, perhaps, but he could also sense the unseen influence the Apache man now held over her. That influence was quiet, almost invisible, yet undeniable. It was in the way she clung to the blanket, the slight tremor in her fingers, the way her gaze flickered toward him as if seeking reassurance. Pride and ownership warred within the husband, and the river had become a symbol of intrusion, of forces that could not be tamed or ignored. The Apache man spoke again, his voice low, measured, almost indifferent to the tension he caused. She was in danger. "I acted. That is all." His eyes met the husband's briefly, a silent challenge that carried no malice, only certainty. The young bride felt a stir of something unfamiliar, respect, perhaps, or curiosity mixed with a subtle fear. She did not yet know what it meant, only that the man beside her had crossed the river into her life and altered its course in ways she could not yet name. Outside, the horse shifted restlessly, hooves scraping against the packed earth, a reminder that the world beyond the house continued its slow, indifferent march. The young bride felt the tension in the room pulse in rhythm with that sound, a heartbeat of anticipation that threatened to snap at any moment. She wondered if the morning would end with words or with action. and she felt the weight of human pride and survival pressing down from all directions. The husband finally moved, his steps deliberate as he approached the fire, the warmth of the hearth brushing against his boots. He did not speak immediately, only studied the Apache man, as if tracing invisible lines of intent, strength, and experience. She noticed the subtle shift in his posture, the way his fingers tightened and relaxed on the edges of the mantle. There was a silent conversation happening, one she could not fully interpret, yet felt in every cell of her body. The river outside seemed to echo the tension, its currents relentless, carrying with them memories of danger and the promise of change. She thought again of the fall, the pull of the water, the cold that had seeped into her bones. The memory now carried with it a new layer, the knowledge that survival had brought her into contact with forces she did not understand, forces that were patient, strong, and quietly demanding her attention. Her thoughts drifted to the small town beyond the trees, to neighbors who would whisper about the morning's events, to the stories that would inevitably grow and twist. The young bride realized that her life had become a narrative not entirely under her control, shaped by fear, courage, and the unpredictable will of others. The Apache man represented a part of that narrative she could not name, a presence that carried weight and authority without ever raising his voice. The husband's voice cut into her thoughts, calm but firm. "There is more to this than you are telling. I can see it in the way you speak, in the way you stand, in the look in your eyes." His words were not accusatory, yet they carried the full force of expectation. She felt the weight of responsibility pressing down, knowing that any misstep could inflame the delicate tension between the two men who now defined her world. The Apache man did not flinch. His gaze was steady, unyielding, yet not hostile. He seemed to understand the delicate balance, the unspoken codes, and the fragility of human pride. His presence was a counterweight to the husband's authority, a reminder that life often placed people in positions where loyalty, courage, and survival intersected in unexpected ways. The young bride's heart beat faster as she realized that the day would demand more than simple explanations. It would demand choices, actions, and an awareness of forces she could not yet fully grasp. The river had changed her. The man who saved her had altered the course of her life, and her husband's expectations loomed like an unspoken threat. Every moment carried the possibility of confrontation, revelation, or the subtle unraveling of order. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying a hint of smoke and the earthy scent of wet soil. The river murmured, relentless and unheeding, a reminder that the world beyond the house remained vast, untamed, and indifferent. The young bride felt herself caught between currents, human will, nature, and circumstance, each pulling in directions she could not yet navigate. She shivered again, unsure if it was the chill or the weight of what was to come. The Apache man's hand brushed against the edge of the blanket she wore, not in intimacy, but in a gesture of assurance. She felt the steadiness of it, the quiet strength, and realized that she was no longer simply the bride who had fallen into the river. She was a survivor, someone whose life had intersected with forces larger than her understanding. And with that recognition came an awareness of the new responsibilities and dangers now threaded into her path. Her husband finally spoke again, his voice a low, careful rumble. "The day will demand answers, and you must be ready. The river may have returned you, but it does not forgive weakness." The words were heavy, carrying both warning and expectation. She nodded, though uncertainty twisted inside her. She was aware that survival had not ended the danger, it had only reshaped it, introduced new players, and altered the course of human will around her. The river continued its quiet flow, carrying with it memories, potential, and unspoken truths. The young bride glanced through the window, watching the light glint off the water, feeling the pull of the currents that had shaped the morning. She realized that every step forward would now be measured against the memory of the fall, the strength of the man who saved her, and the expectations of the husband who claimed her life in ways both familiar and uncertain. The Apache man's gaze lingered on the river briefly, and she sensed an awareness of forces unseen, a knowledge that extended beyond the small clearing into the untamed lands beyond. His presence was a reminder that the world held more than predictable danger, more than routine, and more than the fragile boundaries humans tried to impose on one another. Her husband's stance shifted again, restless but controlled, the reins tightening slightly in his hands. He was calculating, waiting, assessing the currents in the room, the tension in the air, and the potential for events to tip beyond his control. The young bride felt the delicate balance that had held since the river, knowing that any word, gesture, or misstep could ignite conflict or alter the path of all three of them in ways they could not yet predict. She drew a slow, shaky breath, aware of the silence, the weight of expectation, and the subtle power struggle unfolding in the room. The morning had brought more than survival. It had brought the collision of pride, courage, and circumstance. She felt the currents tugging at her, tugging at the balance of the room, and understood that life beyond this moment would demand courage, patience, and awareness. The Apache man remained steady, silent, but present, a reminder of strength beyond immediate understanding. The husband's eyes never left him, and the young bride realized that the day had become a quiet battlefield, one where words, glances, and actions carried as much weight as any physical struggle. The fire flickered, the river murmured, and the morning seemed suspended in a state of anticipation. Every movement was measured, every breath deliberate, as if the world itself were waiting to see which current would claim her, which force would dictate the next step, and which choices would define the course of her life from this morning forward. The young bride looked between the two men, her heart racing, knowing that the events of the river were only the beginning. The tension, the questions, and the unspoken codes would shape everything, and she could feel the weight of history, expectation, and human will pressing in from every angle. The morning stretched on, the air thick with possibility, and the story she had entered was far from over. The river flowed, relentless and indifferent. The fire sputtered, shadows flickering across the walls. And the young bride, wet and shivering, stood at the center of a quiet storm, aware that the currents around her had only begun to shape the life she thought she knew. The morning had delivered her into forces she could not yet comprehend, and she understood that survival, loyalty, and the choices of others would guide the path forward in ways she could not yet see. The silence in the room held, heavy with the weight of unspoken truths and potential consequences. Every heartbeat, every glance, every subtle shift in posture carried meaning. The young bride felt it all pressing in, knowing that the river had changed her life, but the full measure of that change was yet to unfold. Outside, the river murmured its secrets. The wind whispered through the trees. Inside, the fire flickered and shadows danced. And the young bride, caught between two men and the currents of circumstance, realized that the morning had begun a story that would test her, shape her, and demand every ounce of courage she could summon. She shivered again, pulling the blanket tighter. The tension in the room was unbroken, the currents outside relentless. And in that quiet, charged space, the young bride understood that she had survived the river, but survival was only the beginning. The story of the day, and of the forces that had brought her here, was far from resolved. The hours passed with a weight that seemed to press the walls inward. The young bride moved cautiously through the small house, each step measured, each glance toward the doorway revealing the silent watchfulness of her husband and the quiet vigilance of the Apache man. The fire in the hearth sputtered and flared, shadows dancing across the wooden walls as if mocking the fragile calm she tried to maintain. Every sound hooves on the packed earth outside, the river murmuring beyond the trees, the creak of floorboards underfoot carried the promise of disruption, the inevitability of change that the morning had already begun. She wrapped the blanket tighter around her shoulders, feeling the cold still clinging to her damp skin. The river, relentless in its flow, had left a mark beyond the water and mud. It had unsettled the rules of her world, shifting loyalties and testing the limits of human will. The Apache man remained near, his presence steady and unyielding, an anchor amid the storm she did not yet fully understand. She could feel the strength in him, but also a strange patience, as if he knew something the world around them had yet to reveal. Her husband's eyes never left the pair, dark and deliberate, calculating in ways she could not ignore. Pride and ownership warred in him with every breath he drew, and the memory of the river's grip on her life only sharpened his need to assert control. She realized that the tension between the two men had grown into a silent battle, one where words were as dangerous as any act of violence. She shivered not only from cold but from the sense that the morning had set forces in motion that would not be contained by walls, by rules, or by any measure of human expectation. The Apache man's voice broke the quiet, low, and deliberate. The river does not forgive hesitation. You must remain vigilant. His words were simple, but the way he said them carried a gravity that seemed to fill the room. The young bride felt the weight of them, a reminder that survival was only the beginning, and that the currents of danger, loyalty, and human will were already pulling her forward. Outside, the wind stirred again, carrying the earthy scent of wet soil, smoke from distant fires, and the sharp tang of the river. The young bride moved closer to the window, watching the water swirl and eddy around rocks and fallen branches. The memory of her fall rose unbidden, the sudden pull of the current, the cold that burned through her bones, the hands that had lifted her back into life. She shivered again, uncertain if it was fear or anticipation, aware that the river had already changed her, and that the world beyond the glass carried dangers and choices she could not yet name. Her husband shifted, the reins of his horse tightening in his hands, a subtle signal that he was not idle, that he was weighing every possibility, every unseen motion in the room. The young bride sensed the unspoken challenge, the quiet assertion of authority, and the invisible boundary that had been disrupted by the morning's events. She realized that survival, loyalty, and expectation were now entwined in a complex web, and any wrong step could ignite a conflict that the river had only begun to stir. The Apache man moved closer, silent but deliberate, his hand brushing lightly against the edge of the blanket she wore. It was not a gesture of intimacy but of reassurance, a reminder that she had been saved, that she had endured, and that the forces now shaping her life were not entirely cruel. She felt a flicker of something she could not yet name, trust, curiosity, even admiration, but fear lingered, a shadow that had not yet lifted. The husband spoke again, his voice low, deliberate, each word measured as though testing the atmosphere for cracks. I need the truth, every part of it. What happened by the river, who was involved, and why? The words carried the weight of expectation, of judgment, and the unspoken possibility of retribution. The young bride swallowed hard, aware that the morning had already altered her life, and that the consequences of every revelation were uncertain, dangerous, and inescapable. She began to speak, recounting the river's pull, the sudden struggle, the fear that had nearly claimed her life. Her words trembled at first, but the steady presence of the Apache man beside her lent her strength, and she continued, describing the cold, the current, the shock of near drowning, and the hands that had lifted her from the water. Every word carried weight, every memory a reminder of vulnerability and survival. Her husband listened silently, dark eyes unblinking, measuring not only the truth in her voice but the subtle shifts in posture, the flicker of her gaze, the way she responded to the presence of the Apache man. She could feel the tension building, a coil tightening between them, the air thick with expectation and unspoken threat. Outside, the river continued its relentless journey, a reminder that life moved forward with or without consent. indifferent to the delicate balance humans tried to maintain. The young bride's thoughts drifted to the moments after she had been pulled from the river, the strange mixture of fear and relief, the unexpected strength of the man who had intervened. She realized that the morning had delivered not only survival but a new perspective on courage, loyalty, and the unpredictable currents of human behavior. The Apache man represented forces she could not fully understand, yet his presence was undeniably central to the unfolding story. The husband finally spoke, his voice carrying both warning and challenge. "You owe me the full account." Nothing hidden, nothing omitted. His gaze shifted subtly toward the Apache man, a silent measure of the man's intent, strength, and respect for boundaries. The tension tightened, each second stretching longer, each unspoken thought pressing against the fragile calm. The river murmured in the distance, relentless and indifferent. The young bride drew a slow breath, wrapping the blanket tighter, aware of the stakes she now faced. Survival had brought her to this point, but it had also delivered uncertainty, human will, and forces beyond her control. Every glance, every movement, every breath carried meaning. The currents of circumstance tugged at her, pulling her toward choices she could not yet make. The Apache man's voice broke the silence again, quiet but firm. "The river leaves its mark. The choices you make now will define the path ahead." She felt the weight of his words, a subtle command cloaked in calm observation. They carried both warning and assurance, a recognition that the morning had altered not just her body, but the course of her life. Her husband's hand brushed the doorframe as he moved closer to the fire, eyes never leaving the man who had entered their lives with quiet authority. The young bride sensed the unspoken negotiation taking place in every glance, every shift of posture, every measured movement. Pride, ownership, and the legacy of human expectation collided with courage, survival, and the presence of forces she could not fully grasp. The room seemed to hold its breath, shadows stretching across the walls as the fire flickered and the river murmured in the distance. Every heartbeat felt magnified, every small gesture laden with consequence. The young bride realized that the morning's events had set a stage she could not leave, and that the resolution of tension, loyalty, and authority would demand courage, patience, and awareness of forces beyond her control. The Apache man moved slightly, adjusting the blanket over her shoulders with the quiet precision of someone accustomed to action without words. She felt the steady weight of his presence, the calm assurance that he would not allow harm while he remained. And yet, the tension in the room was not diminished. If anything, it had grown, layering uncertainty atop vulnerability, challenge atop trust. Outside, the river continued its indifferent journey, reflecting the rising sun in fractured glints of light. The young bride glanced at it, seeing in its movement a mirror of the tension within her own life, the push and pull of forces beyond her command, the delicate balance between survival and expectation, the uncertainty of human will. She shivered again, unsure if it was cold or the anticipation building in her chest. Her husband finally spoke again, the words deliberate, measured, carrying both authority and restrained emotion. "The day will demand answers, and I expect truth in every gesture, every word, and every thought you share." The young bride felt the weight of his expectation pressing against her, and she realized that survival alone would not suffice. She must navigate the currents of human pride, fear, and curiosity to find the next step. The Apache man's gaze flicked toward the window, toward the river, and for a moment, she sensed the depth of knowledge he carried, the understanding of currents, forces, and survival in ways she could not yet grasp. His presence was a reminder that the world beyond the house, beyond the morning, held truths that were silent, relentless, and powerful. She felt the tension coiling in the room, stretching longer with every heartbeat. The fire flickered again, shadows dancing across the walls like warnings. The river murmured, relentless, uncaring. And the young bride, caught between the two men and the invisible currents of circumstance, realized that the story had reached a point where every choice, every movement, and every word would carry the weight of consequence. Her eyes moved from the Apache man to her husband, seeing in both figures the strength, pride, and determination that had been set against her since the river claimed her. She shivered once more, feeling the intensity of the morning, the unspoken challenges, and the anticipation of events yet to unfold. The currents of human will and circumstance swirled around her, invisible yet undeniable, demanding awareness and courage in equal measure. The Apache man's hand rested lightly on the edge of a chair, a subtle presence, a reminder of strength and patience. Her husband's fingers brushed the reins, a signal of control and readiness. The young bride stood between them, wet and trembling, aware that the morning had begun a story far larger than survival alone. It was a story of courage, trust, and the quiet assertion of human will against forces both natural and unpredictable. The room held its breath, every sound amplified in the charged silence. Outside, the wind shifted, the river murmured, and the fire in the hearth flickered with restless energy. She realized that the currents of circumstance would not wait, that the day would demand choices, actions, and courage she had yet to summon. The tension was at its peak, balanced delicately between fear, anticipation, and the possibilities of what could come next. The young bride drew a deep breath, feeling the blanket slip slightly from her shoulders, a small reminder of her vulnerability. She glanced once more at the Apache man, then at her husband, sensing the fragile balance of power, expectation, and human will. Every moment felt as though it could tip the scales, set in motion forces beyond her control, or bring the first step toward the resolution she so desperately needed but could not yet see. The fire crackled again, casting light and shadow across the room. The river whispered outside, relentless and constant. The young bride stood at the center of this quiet storm, aware that the climax of the morning's tension had not yet arrived, that the current set in motion by the river and the two men who now defined her world would demand her attention, courage, and action. The story was poised on the edge, the suspense unbearable, and every heartbeat carried the promise of revelation, confrontation, and the approach of the turning point that would shape everything to come. The morning stretched long, the shadows deepened, and the currents of circumstance continued to swirl. The young bride shivered, aware of the weight of survival, the strength of the man who had saved her, and the expectations of the one who claimed her life. She understood now that the river had delivered her not only into life, but into a moment of choice, danger, and suspense, and that the resolution of the day would demand every ounce of courage she could summon. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, carrying the smell of wet earth and distant smoke. The river murmured, indifferent to human struggles and desires. Inside, the fire flickered, shadows dancing across the walls as if mocking the fragile calm. The young bride drew another deep breath, knowing that the climax of this day, the turning point that would define her fate, was close, though still unseen, and that every second, every glance, every subtle movement carried her closer to a moment of revelation she could neither predict nor control. The Apache man remained silent, steady, an anchor amid the storm. Her husband's eyes never left him, a silent contest of pride, authority, and vigilance. The young bride felt the tension coil tighter, every movement charged with possibility, every second a marker of anticipation. The river outside continued its relentless course, mirroring the currents of circumstance that had drawn her into this story, and she realized with a mixture of fear and awe that she was poised on the edge of everything. The moment before resolution, the instant before choices would become action, and the second before life would demand courage she had yet to fully summon. The silence, the fire, the river, the two men, and the young bride herself all held in a delicate balance, waiting for the first move, the first word, the spark that would tip the morning into the climax of tension, suspense, and human will. The story had reached its precipice, and every heartbeat brought her closer to the turning point that would carry her toward what she hoped could be a beginning of relief, understanding, and perhaps even happiness. The young bride stood, wet and shivering, aware that the moment of reckoning was near, that the river's currents had shaped her into someone ready to face what was to come, and that the tension in the room had reached its peak. The Apache man's steady presence, her husband's watchful eyes, and the relentless flow of the river outside combined to create a storm of anticipation, the kind that precedes revelation, confrontation, and the first steps toward a resolution that had yet to be revealed. And in that charged silence, the young bride felt it, the impossible weight of the morning, the unbroken tension, and the near certainty that the climax was poised to arrive. She shivered, not from cold but from the intensity of the moment, knowing that the currents of human will, courage, and circumstance would soon demand action, and that the river had delivered her to the edge of something that would change everything. The story was poised, the suspense unbearable, and the young bride, caught between two men and the invisible forces of the morning, understood that what came next would define her life, her choices, and the delicate balance of survival and trust. The river whispered outside, the fire danced, and the room held its breath, waiting for the moment when tension would burst into revelation and the path toward resolution would begin, though the end was not yet in sight. Every glance, every subtle movement, every heartbeat brought her closer to the precipice. The morning had shifted her life irrevocably. The river, the Apache man, and her husband had all left marks that would not fade. And as the wind stirred through the trees and the water continued its relentless course, the young bride shivered once more, aware that the climax of the day, the instant before choices became action, and before tension broke into resolution, was approaching, and that the currents of fate and human will were about to carry her into a moment she could neither predict nor escape. The fire crackled, the river murmured, and the silence hung between them all, thick and unyielding. And in that fragile, charged space, the young bride understood with absolute clarity that the story was at its height, the moment before the storm, the second before decisions would shape everything, and the instant where suspense, danger, and anticipation converged, holding her on the edge of a day that would redefine her life forever. The wind whispered, the river swirled, and the young bride drew a trembling breath. Wet and shivering, poised between survival and expectation, between courage and fear, and between two men whose presence now defined the very shape of her world. The climax approached, yet the resolution remained unseen, the suspense unbearable, and the currents of human will, pride, and circumstance pulled her inexorably toward a turning point that would demand every ounce of strength she could summon. The morning had stretched into a long, tense afternoon, and yet inside the small house, the air had begun to shift. The young bride stood near the window, blanket drawn tightly around her shoulders, and watched the river flow steadily past. The currents that had pulled her into danger now seemed gentler, quieter, almost forgiving. Outside, the horse shifted restlessly, but the tension that had filled the room since the fall had begun to loosen, subtle and almost imperceptible. Her husband finally moved closer, his voice still carrying authority but softened with the wear of the morning. "I have seen the truth in your eyes, in the way you survived, and in the way you trusted someone you hardly knew. That takes courage." The words hung in the room, carrying a recognition she had not expected. She looked up, surprised to see the tight lines of his face relax just slightly. For the first time that day, she felt a spark of understanding, a moment where the walls of fear and expectation that had pressed down on her began to crack. The Apache man remained near, calm and patient, his presence steady but unobtrusive. He had not sought recognition, nor had he demanded respect, yet the room seemed to acknowledge his quiet strength. The young bride realized that his intervention had not only saved her body, but had also reshaped the relationships around her. The tension between her husband and the man who had saved her seemed to settle into an uneasy, silent accord. She drew a slow breath, feeling the chill in her bones slowly give way to the warmth of the fire. The river outside reflected the sunlight in gentle ripples, and the danger that had seemed so immediate now felt like a memory, a vivid one, but one that had passed. She moved to the hearth, kneeling to adjust the fire, and felt the weight of the morning's events lift gradually from her shoulders. She could still feel the river's pull in her chest, but it was no longer a force threatening to sweep her away. Her husband sat down, finally letting himself rest against the chair by the fire. He looked at her with something more than ownership or expectation in his eyes. There was recognition, a quiet gratitude, and a willingness to share the burden of the morning. "You survived what many would not," he said softly, "and we are all here because someone acted without hesitation. That is not something I can forget." The young bride's gaze flicked toward the Apache man. He nodded slightly, a gesture that carried acknowledgement but no pride. There was respect in that small movement, a recognition of life preserved, courage displayed, and trust extended. She realized then that the fear and tension that had dominated the morning had been replaced with understanding, a fragile, delicate understanding, but one strong enough to hold them together. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, carrying the scent of the river, wet earth, and the promise of a calm afternoon. The young bride moved closer to her husband, her hand brushing his lightly, a gesture that carried gratitude, acknowledgement, and the quiet relief of having survived more than the river itself. He reached out, taking her hand in a grip that was firm yet gentle, a promise that whatever had been unsettled would now begin to heal. The Apache man prepared to leave, his task completed. The young bride and her husband both moved toward the door, stepping outside to watch him mount his horse. There was no fanfare, no ceremony, only the quiet dignity of a man who had acted with courage and precision. He tipped his head slightly, and then, without another word, rode off toward the river, leaving them with the aftermath of the morning, the memory of danger, and the relief of survival. The young bride turned to her husband, feeling the warmth of the sun and the strength of his presence. "I never expected. I never imagined things would turn out like this," she said, her voice quiet but steady. He nodded, understanding in his eyes. The tension that had ruled the morning now transformed into something more enduring, trust. He placed his arm around her shoulders, drawing her close, and she felt the weight of fear, expectation, and uncertainty finally ease. "The river tested us all," he said, "but it also showed us what matters. Courage, trust, and the willingness to act when it is needed most." She nodded, realizing that the events of the morning had left her changed, not just by fear, but by the strength she had found within herself and the bonds that had formed between the three of them. The river flowed quietly in the distance, a reminder of the day's events and the power of forces beyond human control. The young bride stepped closer to the water, watching the sunlight glint off the ripples, and felt a sense of peace she had not known before. The fear of the fall, the tension between the men, and the uncertainty of survival had all passed, leaving only gratitude, understanding, and a quiet happiness that seemed both fragile and strong. Her husband stood beside her, hand in hers, and together they watched the river, knowing that the day had tested them, reshaped them, and reminded them of the value of courage and trust. The young bride smiled softly, feeling the warmth of the sun, the gentle pull of the river, and the steady presence of the man she loved beside her. She realized that the river had not only saved her life but had revealed the depths of human will, compassion, and understanding. The small town beyond the trees remained distant, unaware of the morning's events, yet the young bride understood that the world would continue to move forward, carrying with it stories, lessons, and the quiet victories of survival. She turned to her husband, seeing in his eyes not just relief but pride. not just authority but the promise of partnership, and she felt a happiness that had been absent before the river pulled her into its currents. The fire inside the house had burned down to glowing embers, and the room felt warmer now, safer, as if the morning's tension had been absorbed into the walls and dissipated. The young bride returned inside, wrapping the blanket around her shoulders one last time, feeling the memory of the river fade, replaced by the warmth of home, the presence of her husband, and the knowledge that courage, trust, and action had shaped the course of the day. Her husband followed her, and together they sat near the hearth, letting the quiet of the afternoon settle around them. They did not speak at first, allowing the silence to honor what had passed the danger, the fear, and the courage it had taken to endure. Then, slowly, they began to talk, sharing thoughts, reflections, and the relief of having survived more than just the river's currents. The young bride spoke of fear, of the cold, of the unexpected strength of the Apache man, and of the lessons she had learned about courage and trust. Her husband listened, nodding, understanding not only her words but the unspoken truths they carried. The house, once a stage for tension and uncertainty, now felt like a haven, a place where the past could be acknowledged and the future shaped with hope, gratitude, and love. The day drew toward evening, and the river glinted in the sunlight, calm and unthreatening. The young bride stepped outside once more, hand in her husband's, and looked at the water that had changed everything. She felt a quiet connection to the river, to the man who had saved her, and to the life that awaited beyond the morning. It was a connection forged in fear, courage, and survival, now transformed into understanding, trust, and a deep appreciation for life. Her husband stood beside her, silent but steady, and together they watched the sun begin its descent, casting golden light across the trees and the river. The young bride realized that the events of the day had not only tested them but had shaped them, revealing the strength of character, the depth of courage, and the enduring power of trust. The fear and tension that had ruled the morning had given way to relief, reflection, and the quiet happiness of survival and understanding. The Apache man had gone, yet his presence lingered in their thoughts, a reminder of action taken without hesitation, of courage displayed without expectation of reward, and of the ways in which lives intersect in moments of danger and choice. The young bride felt gratitude for his intervention, for the lessons of the morning, and for the quiet understanding that had grown between her and her husband in the hours that followed. The wind shifted again, carrying the scent of wet earth and river water, and she breathed deeply, feeling the calm settle in her chest. The fire inside had cooled, the shadows of the house softened, and the world outside seemed alive with possibility. The young bride smiled, recognizing that the morning had begun with fear and uncertainty, but had ended with clarity, courage, and a sense of belonging she had not known before. Her husband looked at her, eyes softened by relief and understanding. "We survived," he said simply, yet the words carried more than acknowledgement. They carried pride, trust, and a promise that the bonds tested that morning would endure. The young bride nodded, feeling the warmth of his hand in hers and the quiet joy of knowing that courage, trust, and human will had prevailed. As the sun dipped lower, the river gleamed in reflection, calm and forgiving. The young bride knew that the currents of life would continue to flow, carrying with them challenges, choices, and moments that demanded courage. Yet the events of the day had shown her that survival, trust, and the willingness to act with courage could shape outcomes, forge bonds, and reveal the strength hidden within the human heart. Inside the house, the fire now a gentle glow. The young bride and her husband sat together, wrapped in the quiet of the afternoon, and reflected on the morning's events. Every glance, every word, and every moment of tension had led them here to understanding, to gratitude, and to a happiness forged from courage and survival. The river had tested them, yet it had also illuminated what mattered most: trust, love, and the strength to endure. The young bride smiled softly, feeling the warmth of her husband's hand and the quiet presence of life continuing beyond the house and river. She realized that the day had changed everything, yet it had also offered a new beginning. The fear, the tension, and the uncertainty had given way to clarity, reflection, and a quiet happiness that could be carried into every moment that followed. The river flowed, the sun set, and the small house seemed to breathe with the relief and peace of the day's conclusion. The young bride, once pulled into the river's grasp, now stood on solid ground, strengthened by survival, trust, and the bonds forged in a morning of fear, courage, and revelation. The story had reached its end, and the currents of life, love, and understanding carried her forward into a future she could now face with hope, gratitude, and the quiet happiness of a life reclaimed. The wind whispered through the trees one last time. The river reflected the fading light, and the young bride and her husband stood together, hand in hand, knowing that the morning had tested them, shaped them, and revealed the courage within. The past had been survived, the present understood, and the future awaited with promise. They turned toward the house, ready to step inside together, carrying with them the lessons of fear, survival, and trust, and the enduring knowledge that life, when faced with courage and understanding, could lead to joy and lasting connection. And as the night settled over the river, over the trees, and over the small house, the young bride felt a peace she had not known before. The river, once a force of danger and uncertainty, now seemed to flow in harmony with her heart. The Apache man had gone, but his courage remained in memory. Her husband, once distant in expectation and pride, now stood as a partner in trust and understanding. And she, wet and trembling at dawn, now stood whole, grateful, and ready to face whatever the currents of life might carry, knowing that courage, love, and trust had guided her to a good and lasting ending. The day closed, the fire faded to embers, and the river's gentle murmur became a lullaby for the life that had been tested and saved. The young bride smiled one last time, hand in her husband's, heart steady, knowing that the story that began with fear and tension had reached a place of hope, connection, and the quiet, enduring joy of a life reclaimed. The river would flow on, but so would they, together, strengthened by what had passed and ready for whatever lay ahead.